Thank you very much, and if you'll allow me, I think I'll try to walk around a little bit. I feel a little bit too royal sitting in this throne seat, and also it gives me a chance to be out and among you to first congratulate all of you for your interest and your focus on world affairs and world politics. I think too many of young people of my generation, but also of your generation, tend to focus colloquially just on their own country or their own neighborhood. And the people who are taking a broader view, I think, are important for the future of the world. So I want to thank you all for taking that on. And also to say to you today that I'll talk for a while and probably longer than you want, but I hope that we'll have a lot of time to hear from you, not just questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions, but also to hear your points of view and what you see as the challenges facing the world that will be your world of the future. You know, when I joined our diplomatic service over 30 years ago, it was an entirely different world than the world we see today. It was a world in which ideology was much more important in national policies, and it was a world in which certain countries, and my own country was one, but the Soviet Union on the other side was the other, looked globally, and they approached everything as part of a global competition between two basic value systems, in which the rest of the world was hopefully being pulled in one direction or the other. The world that we face today, I think, is very much different than the world that I faced as a person your age when I entered into our diplomatic service. It's a world in which regional activities and national activities are much more important than global outlooks. Even as we talk about globalization and the importance of knowing what's going on in the world, I think most nations have restricted their point of view much more to a regional point of view. And there are only 2 or 3 countries in the world which really still have a global outlook. I think the United States is one. I think the European Union as a grouping is another. The Russians perhaps as a third, and increasingly China as a fourth. But that is rare among nations. The other thing I think that's really important to think about is that the world has become, rather than more peaceful, more well-organized, just the opposite is happening in the world today. Conflict is much more common today than it was 35 years ago when I was studying world affairs as you are today. And that's a key element. A second element is that as time has evolved, the world has also evolved. And I think this is one of the key thing for we as Americans to think about and you as Europeans to think about, that 30 years ago, the world was focused on this transatlantic region. It led world affairs in the conflict in the Cold War, but also economically, culturally, with our values. We drove the world, but the world is changing. The locus of power, the locus of gravity is shifting slowly but surely towards Asia. And that has been the dynamic of your lifetime. Not of my lifetime, but only of your lifetime. And I think that's an important thing to think about. The power dynamic in the world is shifting towards Asia. And this graph up here just shows the percentage of world GDP which is controlled by different regions of the world. And if you look at the red line, the Asia and Pacific, you can see the ramp up in its control of world GDP. So my own president now talks about the pivot towards Asia, about American foreign policy focusing more on our Asian relations. And here in Europe, when Europeans hear pivot towards Asia, they say America doesn't care so much about Europe. America is losing its focus on Europe. And one of the key messages I hope you'll bring back from my lecture today is, I don't believe that's true. That pivoting towards Asia is a reality. Europeans should be doing the same. You should be looking at what's going on in Asia and thinking about what it means for your countries, for this region of the world, but it doesn't mean that European and American relations are getting less important. In fact, the basic message I hope you'll go away with from this lecture is that it is getting more important. Having said that, those numbers mean something. Today, 58% of the world's GDP is based around the Pacific Rim. About 50% of the world's GDP is based upon the Atlantic Rim. You're all doing the math, I know, and you can all figure out that that's more than 100%. And that's because my country is both a Pacific Rim nation and also a transatlantic nation, and therefore our numbers are counted on both sides. But what it shows is the importance of the rise of Asia in the way that we think about the world. Add to that all of the problems that we see going on. We see a Middle East and North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa full of conflict in a way that did not define international politics 35 years ago. The Middle Eastern politics 35 years ago were all based upon the Arab-Israeli conflict. And the rest of it was revolving around that. Today in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict remains very much a center of focus. But so does the rise of Iran, the chaos in Iraq, the civil war in Syria, domestic unrest in Egypt, the Arab Spring, the problems of Yemen, terrorist forces in the Saudi Peninsula. All of those are elements that world leaders have to think about when addressing the Middle East. Sub-Saharan Africa has become a region of fast growth, but also of great instability. Latin America 35 years ago was seen by Americans as a series of autocratic governments that were in our sphere of influence that we had to deal with. In the last 35 years, much of Latin America has become democratic. Much of Eastern Europe has become democratic with the fall of the Soviet Union, so that scholars of international relations 15 years ago were talking about the end of history, the victory of the democratic way and the value system, which was in fact embodied by the transatlantic relationship. But 15 years later, I don't think they're speaking of that any longer. We're seeing the rise again of Russia and of a new nationalistic Russia, a Russia which says openly, the West's values are not our values. And they are gaining adherence to that point of view. China says openly, the West's values are not our values. And their economic model is something that many countries look to for their own development now. So the transatlantic dominance of the end of the last century is no longer the situation we face today. Add to that, in addition to the unrest in the Middle East, in addition to the resurgence of Russia, in addition to the incredible growth of China, a world which is facing many challenges which are not national or not even intergovernmental. They are transboundary challenges, which we all have to face together. I talked about terrorism, trafficking in people, environmental challenges, economic challenges to the stability of our economies coming from trans-border integration, immigration, refugees. All of these things are complicating, I think, the world for foreign policy practitioners and issues that you all will have to deal with as you go ahead. So in all of that, with the world shifting towards Asia, with Putin on the rise and perhaps trying to recreate something that resembles the Soviet Union, does it matter what is going on between America and the European Union or between the NATO allies? That's the real question I think that we have to face. And the key answer that I would say to you today is, in fact, far from being less important today than when I became a diplomat, transatlantic relations are more important. Because together we are still the prominent economic powers of the world. Together we are still the only nations which share a common value system. Together we are still the most able to act globally, but separately we will fail, and we are falling behind. And the time is now for a renaissance in our relations, not to ignore America if you're a European or Europe if you're an American, but in fact to double down on that bet. The bet that has been in fact the prevailing trend since the end of World War II of partnership, integration, and moving forward together between Europe and the United States. Because America needs, not once, but needs a strong Europe. One of the great ironies of international relations is that Americans have also always been bigger fans of European integration than Europeans have. Because we want a strong Europe. Because a strong Europe is a strong partner for the United States of America. And we need you to succeed so that we can also succeed in the world. For all of the talk, all of that movement towards Asia, the pivot towards Asia by the Obama administration, the reality of today is frankly not that much different than the reality of a decade ago in our economic relationship. And I'll just throw out a few statistics for you. We are the largest trading relationship in the world, Europe and America. $5 trillion, that's 1,000 billion, I guess is the correct way of saying it in Europe. $5 trillion in a commercial relationship between the United States and Europe. 15 million people in Europe and the United States are employed today precisely because of that economic and commercial relationship. 15 million people's jobs depend upon the strength of our economic interaction. As much as we talk about being a Pacific nation and our focus on the growing powers in Asia, 45 out of 50 American states export more to Europe than they do to Asia. Only our West Coast states have a greater focus on Asia. 45 out of 50 of the states which make up my country should care a heck of a lot more about what's going on in Europe than what's going on in Asia. And let me give you a few kind of little examples of that. We talk about the rise of China, and China very much is critical to the future. But European investment in the United States is 4 times larger than European investment in China. And it's growing. We talk about the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. But in fact, US foreign direct investment in Brazil, a closer neighbor to us than Europe, since 2000 has been less than US foreign direct investment in Ireland. One small country here in Europe gains a lot more investment than all of Brazil because of the depth and the strength and the historical ties which have always existed between the United States and Europe. Our merchandise trade, despite all the growth and all the problems that we've had in the last 5 years economically, both in the United States and in Europe, US merchandise trade with Europe and vice versa has doubled since the year 2000. It continues to grow. It continues to be a major engine of growth, what little we've seen on both sides of the Atlantic. And those are key elements which I think that we have to bear in mind. So for my country, when we look around the world and think about who is going to be our partner in facing challenges together. Because I think it is clear that during the Obama administration's time in power, but also even under the Bush administration before, Americans recognize that there is no unilateral power in the world. That to do anything in the challenges we face, we have to work together. We have to have partners. There will be no conflict sanctioned in the world that is not sanctioned by the United Nations. There will be no way to face the challenges of hunger or AIDS in Africa if we don't do it together. Because together we are stronger. And therefore, I come back to this point of a transatlantic renaissance, a rebirth in our relations as the basis for moving forward in a world which, honestly, we are losing right now. Europe and America are losing our competitiveness vis-a-vis other parts of the world. And unless we reinvest in our relationship, we will continue to fall behind. As big as we are, as powerful as we are, we will continue to fall behind in the dynamic changes going on in the world. So the first step in what I call this transatlantic renaissance is in fact a recommitment to economic growth in our economies. A recommitment to what made us great in the past and to focus on reviving our growth. Because while the rise of Asia has been incredible and actually good for us, admirable, these relative changes are really about our growth slowing down. Our inability to keep our economies going at the same dynamic pace that we saw in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And we need to focus back on our economic relationship. And if I can in that one, I'll just turn to the question of growth and take a look at this. 2008 was a brutal wake-up call to all of us. And I'll be the first to admit it started in my country. We were partly to blame for the economic instabilities which led to 2008. But I will also say that, as these statistics show, by 2010, we had already reached bottom or coming up. So had Europe as a whole. But Europe's bottom was lower, and its return to growth has also been lower and less long-term, less stable. So while since 2010 we have seen steady periods of economic growth in the United States of America, in Europe the situation has been quite different. The situation, I think, quite a bit more difficult for Europe. And unless we can see a stable return to growth between all of our countries, I think that we're going to find it difficult to deal with a rising Asia and a rising Africa and the changing dynamics in the world. So we have to reinvest in our own economic potential. We have to double down on this relationship, as I said, and do so in a way that not only creates growth, but creates jobs. You all, my own son who's about your age, are all facing the same problem. The job market out there is very tough. Our economies, even if they are growing, are not creating enough jobs, enough good quality jobs to serve the future of our needs. And I don't have to tell you that, but I will show you some of the figures anyhow, just to make you feel even worse. The number of people employed in Europe and in the United States has been relatively feeble. Even in the United States, the blue line, which is going up since the beginning of 2011, and we have created 7 million new jobs in my country since the recession ended. 7 million new jobs, something which in Europe would be absolutely astounding. Part of that is you have to also understand the differences. My country is growing in its population, and therefore 7 million jobs is enough to have our unemployment rate falling, but not enough to have our unemployment rate falling as much as we would like. In contrast, however, the picture in Europe is all over the map. It's up and down. But the trend line, unfortunately, is down. Fewer jobs. And Europe needs to think seriously about what that means. What is it that's going wrong here? That the economies of Europe, as strong as they are, as industrialized as these economies are, as competitive internationally as European economies are, why is it that this entire continent is not producing the sort of jobs that people would like to? Now let's move even further to the question of youth unemployment. These are the figures on youth unemployment across Europe. The numbers are astounding. You all see Italy over there. These figures are a little bit old, slightly below 40% unemployment among Italian youth. It's in fact even higher than 40% now. But across the board, Europe is failing its next generation and needs to find a way to move back towards a more rapid growth. We are doing the same thing in the United States, but it's focused on issues such as training and education. It's focused on labor flexibility. It's focused on attacking the bureaucratic inertia, which is making it difficult for companies to create new jobs, or having done so in a downturn to get rid of the people who are on the rolls. It's a focus on the digital economy. And here, Italy and Europe in general, but certainly in Italy, you guys are falling behind. This is an area where simply unleashing the digital economy could add 1 to 2% to the GDP growth of this country every year. But the infrastructure of Italy and the infrastructure of Europe in general is not as receptive to new modern economic measures as perhaps it could be. It means harnessing the power of the youth who are coming up in Europe, you all here, but also immigration into this region. Europe has gone from being an immigrant country, an emigrant, that is people who are leaving country, to an immigrant region where people are coming in. And the problems of integrating those people, educating them and making them productive within society, but also using young, hungry workers for what you can, is an area which can add to the growth of Europe as a whole. Europe needs to look at the biotech revolution that's underway elsewhere in the world and make decisions, very serious decisions, about what's more important. 0-kilometer food to farm, the beauty, the wonders of Italian food and its quality, or the cost of food, the productivity of your agricultural land, and your ability to export to other nations who are growing and who need food. Biotech offers a lot for growth potential, but it is an area where Europe has turned its back on the technological revolution that's underway elsewhere in the world. So, if we think about this transatlantic renaissance, it has to start with making our economies stronger. And that means changes. It means changes on the macroeconomic level. My own country's deficit remains far too high. We have to find some way to produce more and spend less so that we can move ahead. The euro crisis remains a drag on the European economy. Europe has to find a new path to growth that it is failing to find right now. A second key element, I would call, of this transatlantic renaissance is a focus on energy and its impact on our economies and on our geopolitical position. The events in Ukraine and the Crimea have brought energy back into the focus of debate here in Europe. Similarly, in the United States, for the last decades, we have had this debate about our overdependence on foreign imported energy to meet the needs of our economy, and what that means for the cost of doing business, because energy is a key and vital input into productivity in our country, but also our foreign policies. Can we afford to take the steps we believe we should if we import 60% of our energy from the Middle East and northern South America? Can we afford, can Europe afford to face up to Vladimir Putin and his rise when so many countries in Europe are dependent on Russia for their gas and oil supplies in the future? So we need to focus, again, on a new renaissance, a new focus on a revolution in energy so that we, in fact, can receive our own, produce our own energies, and reduce the costs. And that's happening. It's underway. It's definitely underway elsewhere. I'm sorry, I should have skipped also in the economic thing to talk a little bit about the Transatlantic Partnership. So let me stop about energy for a second and go back. Transatlantic Investment Partnership. As part of this effort to revitalize our relations, our commercial relations with Europe, the United States and the European Union have launched a path last year which could lead, we hope will lead, to essentially a free trade agreement between Europe and the United States. A Europe in which the import costs, as far as customs duties, are zero across the board for Europe and America. But more importantly, because frankly, our tariff levels are rather low already. A Europe and America in which the behind-the-border barriers, the regulatory barriers that we face, begin to disappear. When we work together with Europe to create unified regulations so that a car produced in America can be sold in Europe with no tariff, but also accepted, even though our windshield standard might be slightly different than the European windshield standard, or the way the rear lights look are slightly different than here, and vice versa, that a European car produced for this market and safe enough to drive in Europe, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, is safe enough to drive in the United States. And there shouldn't be a reason that a manufacturer here has to spend $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000 a car to change it to produce for the American market, any more than that same barrier should be for the United States. If a pharmaceutical product is approved for America, I'm not asking Europe to lower its health standards, to lower its regulatory standards, but to accept that we're a pretty big market too. We care about the safety of our consumers, and we've probably done some work on this, and vice versa for Europeans. And while it may not be possible to simply say, okay, we'll accept whatever the European Union accepted, we have to find some way to streamline that process so that those products can come in quickly. Or that a pharmaceutical approved in the United States, once approved at the European Union level, shouldn't have to also be approved at the Italian level. Why should a pharmaceutical company have to go through that? That adds to their costs. We need to work on these sorts of barriers across the board in all sectors, and not allow any interest groups to say, oh, let's put a fence around that because that's too important for us, for cultural reasons, for regional reasons, for industrial labor reasons in our country. We have to bet entirely on this effort and move ahead. That's also got to be part of that economic renaissance. So moving on beyond the Transatlantic Investment Partnership, let's get back to energy. There is a revolution already underway in the energy markets in the United States. It's a very positive one, and it's based upon new technologies, access to energy which heretofore was never possible. It's not a technology which is widely used in Europe, and in fact, it's not a technology which many Europeans want to use. But hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, is gaining access to oil and gas reserves which heretofore for my country were never seemed possible. And as a result, you can see in the graph, since 2005, American dependence on foreign energy sources is steadily declining. And that has a huge impact also on our freedom and ability to act internationally vis-a-vis others. Even more importantly, with more gas available on the local American market, American energy prices are tumbling quite quickly. So that today, a kilowatt hour or a megawatt hour of electricity in the United States costs about 1/4 of what it costs here in Italy. And in a country such as yours, which is so reliant upon manufacturing as the heart of your economic activity in the world and your competitivity in the world, can you afford to have a key input be so much more expensive in this country? Part of it is about the natural resources in Europe. You may not have as many hydrocarbon resources, but it's also about committing to new technologies. It's about decisions all of our national leaders are making on nuclear energy, on new and renewables energy, on liquefied natural gas and ways to import it so that you're not as dependent upon one source so that the price declines. All of these are steps which need to be taken. And as we continue to increase our production, also opening up the European market to the sale of American gas, which by our own rules is not allowed right now. American natural gas is not allowed to be exported to countries except for those with whom we have a free trade agreement. So once again, going back to TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, if we get that free trade agreement, the European market also comes open to liquefied natural gas exports from the United States, which could help reduce your dependency on gas from Europe. Actually, let me go back for a second. I don't know where the back button is on this, but I'll have to ask someone who knows this system. There we go. So an energy revolution is the second kind of key challenge I think that we need to focus on and where we need to move forward. And related to that, and it's, I know, a major concern for Europeans, perhaps higher than for Americans, but not an unimportant concern for Americans, is environmental concerns. We need to face together the environmental challenges. And here, I know the standard view in Europe is that Americans are less concerned about environmental issues. We didn't sign Kyoto. We don't care about global warming. We are polluters. We frack. We do all kinds of things. I'll just kind of throw out a couple things to present a different view. Americans do care about our environment. We do care about the world. We're making an impact through modern technologies, in fact, to reduce our production of greenhouse gases, to produce our efficiency in the use of hydrocarbon resources. And I would just say that US carbon emissions are at the lowest level that they have been in the last 2 decades. And that during a period when we've still had economic growth. You would have seen in the 1990s, Russia's hydrocarbon emissions declined rapidly, but that was caused by deindustrialization, the closing of plants across Europe, not by efficiency. We've done it through efficiencies, we've done it and kept up our growth. And in fact, over the last 8 years, the United States has reduced our total carbon pollution more than any other nation on earth. So for all those who criticize our country, and we can do more, there's no question about it, America is making changes and we are making an impact on our production of greenhouse gases, and that's, I think, what we need to focus on. And then the last renaissance issue I'll talk about is a renaissance in security, a recommitment to our transatlantic relationship as a community of values, but also a community of action, able to take action in the world. And I think there's nothing that has reinforced the importance of this more than what is going on right now in Ukraine. All of a sudden, a Europe which has become rather complacent about its own situation is beginning to look back to the East and think about, well, maybe we do need a stronger defense. As a community of nations within NATO, we all committed in writing that a goal for all of us would be 2% of our GDP spent on defense. The United States, many in my country would argue, spends too much. We spend over 3% of our GDP on defense. The European nations spend about 1.4% of their GDP. And many political leaders in America, as we hear calls that we should do more in Ukraine, that we should do something in Syria, that we should engage on Libya, they say, do Europeans think that they're going to get defense on the cheap and that America will continue to pay for Europe's defense? Is unrest in Libya really our problem? It's really much more Europe's problem. Is what Russia is doing in Ukraine America's problem? From a human rights standpoint, clearly. From international relations standpoint and the rules of the game that we've all agreed upon, yes. But it's a lot more Europe's problem. Because Ukraine's on your doorstep. And refugees who come out of conflict will be coming over here. They're not going to be coming to the United States. And the gas that flows to Europe that feeds your factories goes through Ukraine. It's your problem. And why is it that Europeans aren't ready to commit to being able to do it? France led us all into the Libyan conflict, and I'm glad they did. But the reality is that European nations began the bombing and ran out of bombs after 5 days. And they had to turn to America because we had the arsenal which was necessary to continue the campaign. Europe, if it wants to be engaged in the world, has to be ready to be engaged in the world. It has to be capable of being engaged. And that means a commitment of resources. Here in Italy today, there's a major debate about the F-35 fighter, the next generation of modern war-fighting planes, something which we all committed to together. And as each nation reduces its commitment to that program, as is being debated here in Italy today, the cost of those planes goes up. But the real question is not F-35 or something else, because F-35 is the plane of the future for NATO. NATO has already agreed upon that. The question is, will you have a modern Air Force or not? Will you have a capability to engage or not? And if you want to be engaged, if you want to play a role, you have to pay for it. So Italy needs to recommit to this strategic relationship. Defense spending is too low, but also defense cooperation is too low among Europeans and between Europe and the United States. We spend too much on defense because we don't spend wisely. We don't spend cooperatively. We have 7 different fighter planes, when in fact we could all commit to one technology. The cost of developing would be less for all of us. Similarly for tanks, similarly for any number of things. Europeans need to focus on rapid mobility, the ability to move headquarters operations and troops from one place to another in order to face the challenges we have today. When the Central African Republic runs into problems, we know the French will be there. But we also know that other Europeans, if it goes as a European operation, won't be able to get there unless Americans carry them, because Europeans haven't committed to the strategic lift capabilities necessary to move forces to a place of conflict in order to stop genocide or to create a peaceful situation in the conflict which is on your borders, not on our borders. We need increased intelligence capabilities, integrated strike capabilities. We need to stay sharp and continue exercising. And we also need to focus on other issues that are security related, but not about guns. We need to think about the politics of identity, which are changing so rapidly here in Europe and around the world. I talked earlier about immigration and what that means. The world is a world of conflict. When I talked about military capabilities, look at this graph. Far from being more peaceful after the end of the Cold War, the world has become much more volatile, but volatile in a strange way. It's not about countries going to war with other countries. That's the bottom chart there. And that's been relatively low and in fact declining. It's all about internal conflicts that have an impact on what goes on in our countries through refugee flows, through creating non-state actors in zones which are out of control, terrorist organizations, the focus by other nations on creating their own nuclear capabilities. All of these are issues which come out of all of this conflict. Also, the face of Europe, the face of America is changing, but more so Europe, because America has always been an immigrant nation. Europeans need to find a way to come to grips with the integration of the foreign-born populations that are in their countries. It's rising. The numbers are astounding, especially for many Europeans who are not accustomed to it. But it's also clear if you look at the elementary school level that unless European nations find a way to integrate and make their immigrant populations a net contributor to society and to welcome them as such, Europe will have problems throughout over the coming years. But it's not just about the foreigners who are among us. It's also a strange dynamic happening in Europe of the politics of identity inside Europe, so that the number of regions which are seeking greater autonomy or perhaps even independence from what we recognize as their country of control, the sovereign country, are growing. And I'm not just talking about Russians in Crimea. You can talk about Transnistrians or the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, but you can also talk about the Basque or Scottish independence or perhaps even the Northern League here in Italy. People who say that the region that they want to rule their affairs is not the nation state in which they live today. And dealing with that entire challenge is one I think that we all have to face as we go into the future. I'm about to wrap up and then we can open this to questions. But the last thing, I think the big challenge that's a much bigger challenge for Europe, but also a challenge for the United States, is the demographic challenge we face. And immigration is a part of it, but it's really all about population size and population growth. You know, demography is a cruel science, and it's a long-term science. Things don't change overnight, and you really can't make changes in your demographic trends in the course of one administration or another. It takes a generation or two. Russia is bound to decline in its population no matter what they do, because the number of women of childbearing age in Russia today is much lower than it was a generation before. Similarly, Europe is getting old, very old. Now this, with the lighting, we really can't see this map very well, but what it is talking about the percentage of a country's population which are 25 years or younger. And those which are younger are the darker colors, those which are older are the lighter colors, and then those which are blue are the countries which are really old. Countries which demographers would say are simply on the pathway to losing, because they will have too many old people to take care of and too few young people to take care of them. And Europe is almost all blue. So what does that mean? As I said, demography is a very tough science. It's not going to change overnight, but it means policies adopted by European leaders that encourage having children, but also encourage young people from elsewhere to come into Europe and who integrate them into their societies. Because if not, you won't have the young workers who will pay for the pensions of the older people, and you will face a problem over time. The United States is also in that trend, but not quite as bad. We are a younger, still growing population, but we're in the yellow phase, which means that we're right now at the borderline. And unless we find some way to bring up our young people and to provide for them the futures that people of my generation had, we will also face problems in the future. And then finally, I would just say as part of this renaissance, politics are important also. And we will undergo some changes in my country. This year, we will have another major election on the national level, which could end up with our parliament, both houses being in the hands of one party while the president is in the hands of another, leading to even further paralysis in American politics. But this month, Europeans are going to the polls, and you're electing your next parliament and the next leadership of Europe. And I won't make a quiz of this thing, but I will say among a general Italian audience, most people haven't got a clue what the issues are. They don't even think about the European Parliament, when in fact 70% of all the laws adopted here in Italy today are only following decisions which were made in Brussels before, and they don't even know who the leaders of Europe are. Next, 2 weeks from now, you'll be deciding who's going to be in the Parliament. By the end of the year, you'll have a new president of the European Council. You'll have a new commissioner of the European Union. You'll have a new high representative for foreign policy of the European Union. And I would bet that 90% of Italians haven't got an idea even who these people are, much less what they stand for and what they're pursuing. Who are these faces? These are people who most of the pundits would say are the key candidates for the President of the Council, President of the Commission, the High Commissioner for Foreign Policy. And maybe you know who they are, but most Europeans don't. And that's not really a way to decide your future, is it? When you haven't even got a clue of what the issues are that are being debated or who the people are who are going to carry them out for you. So Europe, as well as the United States, needs a recommitment to a political process which works for the populations. We are stuck in paralysis in the United States. Europeans are having difficulties making decisions about the way forward and don't even know who these people are, just in case you were wondering who those people are and weren't quite sure. So what I'm saying today, and this gets back to my basic point, is that America and the United States are the most important partners for doing things globally in the world. But we are losing our competitivity, we are falling behind, and we are falling behind because we are not committing to the partnership that we deserve for each other and to the growth and economic potential that we all have. And here we are in Italy, the birthplace of the Renaissance. This is the place to start for a new commitment to this sort of regrowth and recommitment to a new technology which will bring us into a new era, and it requires the US and Europe to be cooperating together, because if not, the values that we hold dear will slowly float away and be taken over by others who do not share the same values that we have. Thank you for your attention, and I hope... Thank you.